The air over Okinawa hung thick with diesel smoke and salt. In the corner of a U.S. prisoner camp, a pit of fire hissed and spat canvas, straw, and cloth curling into black ash. Around it, American soldiers laughed and cursed, tossing bundles into the flames. Each bundle belonged to a Japanese woman. Each piece was a private memory, a last link to normal life before captivity. The women stood silent behind barbed wire. The smoke clawed at their throats, but they didn't cough. To move was to invite attention. Their eyes followed one soldier, the youngest, whose hand trembled as he held a bundle of pale fabric. He looked at it, confused, then at the officer barking orders. "Burn it all." The officer said. The private hesitated, his jaw tightening. No one in that camp thought of symbolism. To them, it was hygiene procedure. Orders said every piece of POW clothing had to be burned to stop lice outbreaks and to issue clean U.S. field uniforms. But to these women, it wasn't laundry. It was the last piece of self. Reports later showed more than 350,000 Japanese civilians captured by Allied forces that year. Around 3,000 were women, scattered across camps from the Philippines to Guam. Few spoke English. Fewer still understood why even their undergarments had to be taken. One woman later wrote, "They took everything, even what we wore beneath." She had watched as the soldier hesitated before the fire, his hands shaking. A single gust lifted the fabric in his grip, catching a glint of sunlight before it fell toward the pit. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, at the last second, he pulled it back. No one noticed except her. Their eyes met across the wire, not as guard and prisoner, but as something human, fragile, momentary. The flames crackled louder, swallowing the sound of his disobedience. That night, the fire pit still glowed, embers whispering in the dark. But somewhere inside a barrack, a woman whispered to another. One of them didn't burn it. That rumor, carried on the quiet breath of fear, would ignite something unexpected, a chain of small rebellions inside the camp. And it all began with that single hesitation by the fire. The next morning, the sun scraped low across the camp's tin roofs, turning the ash pile into a field of dull silver. The young American private, barely 20, stood beside it again, the stench of yesterday's fire still clinging to his uniform. His superior officer's voice cracked through the haze. "Private, you burn what's left, understand? Orders are orders." He nodded, but inside, that phrase twisted like a blade. Orders are orders. The bundle he had hidden last night lay deep in his duffel, pressed between his rations and a folded letter from home. It wasn't guilt that kept him from burning it. It was confusion. Why had a strip of women's fabric made him stop when nothing else had? Across the yard, the Japanese women were lined up again. Their hair was cropped short, their old kimonos gone, replaced by rough field uniforms several sizes too large. A medic sprayed them with delousing powder, white clouds bursting over brown skin. One woman, eyes hollow, looked straight at the private. He turned away, jaw clenched. Official U.S. Directives at the time labeled camp sanitation protocols. Ordered destruction of all enemy garments to prevent lice and infection. It sounded rational on paper, but on the ground it became ritual humiliation. Even food bowls and combs were torched in the name of hygiene. The statistics looked clean, the act did not. Later, one nurse wrote, "The men did not understand how it felt for them. To us it was procedure, to them, desecration." The private found himself staring at the pit again that night. He thought of his sister back in Ohio, same age as one of the captives. He remembered her letter, "Promise me you won't forget to be kind, no matter what war tells you." That line burned hotter than the fire itself. He reached into his duffel, fingers brushing the hidden cloth. He didn't know what to do with it, but he knew he couldn't destroy it. So he wrapped it in a handkerchief, tucked it back, and said nothing. In the silence of that camp, where even mercy felt like betrayal, one man's hesitation was about to ripple through walls of fear and command alike. Because soon, someone would discover the cloth wasn't gone at all. Night in the camp was a strange kind of quiet. Too many people pretending to sleep. The guards' boots thudded on gravel, and from the women's barracks came the faint rustle of straw mats and whispered prayers. Inside the guard hut, the young private sat alone, the lantern's flame trembling as if it shared his nerves. He reached into his duffel, unfolded the handkerchief, and stared at what he'd kept. A small, crumpled piece of white cloth, singed at one edge, smelling faintly of smoke and soap. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was pity, maybe memory, but something in that cloth made him feel less like a soldier and more like a man standing at a moral cliff. He thought about the order again. Burn everything. Burn dignity. Burn history. Burn humanity. Reports from that year, later declassified, showed that nearly 1 in 10 American troops quietly disobeyed minor disposal orders. Not out of rebellion, but confusion. The war had rules, the heart didn't. Outside, the rain started, tapping soft rhythms on the tin roof. He tucked the cloth under the plank floor, covering it with dust. He didn't know that a pair of eyes had been watching from the darkness beyond the fence. One of the women, the same who had met his gaze the day before, saw the flicker of movement. She didn't know what he was hiding, but she knew he had hidden something. That night, she whispered to the others. Her voice was barely audible over the rain. He kept one. The words spread quietly through the barracks, moving from mouth to mouth like an invisible fire. By dawn, everyone knew. The women didn't dare hope, but something fragile cracked open inside them. An idea that maybe not all enemies wanted to break them completely. That maybe, under the same smoky sky, decency hadn't died. In the coming days, the guards noticed the women whispering more. Smiling even, one officer wrote in the camp log, increased communication among female internees, possibly unrest. He didn't realize it was hope, not conspiracy. The hidden cloth had become more than fabric. It was a message, unspoken but understood. Humanity had survived the fire. And by the next morning, that whisper would reach ears it shouldn't have. By the fourth night, the whispers had a rhythm soft, pulsing, almost musical. The women huddled close in the dark, trading pieces of rumor as if they were contraband. He kept it. He hid it under the floor. Maybe he'll give it back. Their voices were tremors of faith inside a place built on obedience. The barracks smelled of damp straw and disinfectant. The rain hadn't stopped since the night the private hid the cloth. Each drop hitting the roof sounded like a heartbeat reminding them they were still alive, still capable of believing in something small but pure. Across the yard, the guards smoked under the overhang, pretending not to notice, but the tension was obvious. One corporal wrote in his nightly log, unusual quiet among female captives, whispering observed after lights out. What he didn't realize was that silence wasn't obedience anymore. It was plotting of the gentlest kind. One of the older women, once a teacher from Yokohama, began sewing scraps from her issued uniform at night, hiding stitches under the lining. "If they take what's ours," she said softly, "we make something new." Her fingers were cracked and bleeding, but she sewed anyway. That quiet defiance spread faster than the guards could imagine. Camp records from late 1945 note a heightened morale among women prisoners despite malnutrition and disease. They didn't know it was because of a single hidden cloth, a rumor of mercy that felt like rebellion. The young private, meanwhile, started to feel the weight of his secret. Each time he passed the women's barracks, their eyes followed him. Not with fear, not with hate, but something heavier. Expectation. He knew they knew, and that terrified him more than any battle ever had. One night, as he patrolled the yard, a soft voice slipped through the wire. "Thank you." He froze. It was barely a whisper, but it hit harder than a gunshot. He didn't answer. He just walked faster, boots sinking into the mud. By morning, the senior officer would notice the shift, the faint traces of hope spreading where despair used to live. He would sense it in their posture, their glances, their silence, and that's when he decided to check the ashes himself. The morning broke gray and hard. Mist clung to the barbed wire like cobwebs. The senior officer, a man carved from regulation, stomped across the yard toward the fire pit. 2 guards trailed behind him, rifles slung but ready. The women were ordered to line up again, thin figures wrapped in oversized U.S. uniforms, faces expressionless. The officer crouched by the pit, boots sinking into wet ash. He prodded the remains with a bayonet tip. Metal clasps, buttons, and charred scraps glimmered faintly. He frowned. Count looks off. He muttered, "Something's missing." The guards exchanged glances but said nothing. Official reports from that period show that more than 40% of confiscated POW materials were never logged. Some went missing through theft, some through quiet disobedience. But in this camp, the gap was personal. It carried the scent of insubordination. The officer straightened, eyes cold. "We're doing a full inventory, every item, every body." The women stood silent, their faces unreadable. Only one, the teacher from Yokohama, lowered her gaze. She knew the search was coming, and with it, humiliation. The rumor that had once been hope now became fear. Behind them, the private felt his pulse thundering in his ears. The hidden cloth beneath his floorboard felt heavier than a weapon. He couldn't look at the officer. He couldn't look at the women either. His throat tightened as he heard the next command. "Strip search, every barrack, every prisoner. If something's been concealed, we'll find it." That order wasn't unusual. Allied POW camps ran strict inventory routines. Nothing was supposed to escape regulation. But this time, the search wasn't about lice or hygiene. It was about control. The officer wanted proof that no one soldier or captive had broken his rule. The guards started moving through the barracks, turning over straw mats, pulling at floorboards, emptying buckets and boxes. The women clutched their uniforms, trying not to tremble. The private watched, frozen, as one guard moved closer to his hut. For a heartbeat, the entire camp felt like it was holding its breath. The officer's voice echoed, "No mercy for liars." And in that moment, humiliation became a weapon. By dusk, they would all be standing under the open sky, stripped of more than clothing. By dusk, the wind had gone sharp, slicing through the open yard like a blade. The women were ordered to strip, one by one, under the pale glare of floodlights. Their breath came out in thin white threads against the cold air. Guards moved along the line, barking orders, tossing piles of U.S. field uniforms at their feet, shirts too large, trousers too long, and nothing beneath. The private stood on the edge of the scene, hands trembling behind his back. Every instinct told him to look away, but command demanded he watch. "Standard issue," the officer barked, his voice echoing. "One shirt, one pair of trousers, no exceptions." In the official record, this was Procedure 9, reissue. Sanitation first, dignity second. The paperwork would later say the process took 20 minutes. For the women, it felt like forever. They stood there, stripped of identity, of the delicate cloth that had once separated their skin from the harsh fabric of war. One woman's lips quivered as she whispered, "We wore their men's clothes like ghosts in someone else's skin." Her words would never appear in any report, but they lived on through others, nurses, medics, and even one chaplain who quietly described the scene in a letter home. There was no violence, only shame. Each woman was handed a uniform that smelled of oil and dust, the tag stamped with U.S. Army property. The fabric scratched their skin raw. For many, it wasn't modesty they mourned. It was the feeling that their womanhood had been turned into regulation. The officer watched, satisfied. "That's discipline," he muttered. But behind him, one nurse, an American in her late 20s, felt her stomach twist. She'd been ordered to supervise hygiene checks. Instead, she found herself watching despair clothed in khaki. As night fell, the women shuffled back to their barracks, the oversized uniforms hanging like borrowed armor. They moved silently, each carrying the same unspoken thought. Something human had been burned in that fire, and this was its echo. Inside the infirmary, the nurse sat on her cot, fists clenched. Her gaze fell on a scrap of fabric she'd saved from disposal, a corner torn from a pillowcase. She thought of the women, of their lowered eyes, of their shivering hands. That night, she made a choice that would risk everything. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and loneliness. Outside, the floodlights hummed against the dark, but inside, a single lantern flickered beside a stack of bandages and sewing needles. The nurse, Sergeant Helen Miles, sat hunched over her cot, jaw clenched, eyes wet with exhaustion. In her lap lay that torn pillowcase, soft but defiant, the only fabric she hadn't thrown into the flames. She wasn't supposed to keep anything. Regulation made that clear. All enemy materials to be burned, the manual said, printed in bold. But after watching those women stand half, naked in the cold, obedience had begun to feel like cruelty. Helen took a deep breath, threaded the needle, and began stitching by hand. Each stitch was small, uneven, but deliberate. The room filled with the whisper of fabric pulling through fabric, a sound more sacred than any prayer she knew. She worked until her fingers cramped, piecing together scraps from discarded laundry, old bandages, and ration bag ties. Slowly, something took shape, a makeshift undergarment, nothing fancy, just a gesture. Reports from Red Cross visitors months later would quietly note unauthorized aid by female medics. It was acts like this, tiny, silent, that carried humanity through the machinery of war. When dawn cracked through the shutters, Helen folded her creation carefully, slipped it beneath her jacket, and walked toward the women's barracks. The guard at the gate nodded, used to her morning rounds. She kept her eyes down, heart hammering. Inside, the women stirred from sleep. The Yokohama teacher looked up as Helen entered, her face tight with suspicion, until Helen knelt and slid the small cloth parcel beneath her blanket. No words were spoken, none were needed. That moment, two women from opposite sides of the war, sharing silence instead of fear, hung in the air like static. One understood humiliation, the other guilt. Between them, a fragment of fabric bridged both. Later that day, one of the guards spotted the Yokohama teacher holding something white. He said nothing. Maybe he didn't see it clearly. Maybe he chose not to. Either way, compassion had officially become contraband. But mercy, once smuggled, spreads fast. And before the week was over, Helen's quiet rebellion would no longer be hers alone. By the end of that week, something invisible had begun to move through the camp, quieter than orders, stronger than fear. It started with Helen's secret gift, but by the third night, it had multiplied. One guard looked away as a tin cup was passed through the fence. Another forgot to check a woman's blanket roll. Small, unrecorded mercies rippled across the barbed wire like wind through reeds. The official ledgers would never mention this. They only spoke in numbers and supplies. But later testimonies from medics hinted at it 17 confirmed incidents of contraband compassion. In U.S. run Pacific camps before the war's end, 17 moments where rules bent and humanity slipped through. Inside the women's barracks, the air felt lighter. They whispered of the kind nurse and the quiet soldier. The Yokohama teacher, once silent, began teaching again small English words, whispered lessons of thank you, hope, tomorrow. Even laughter, faint and careful, returned for the first time since their capture. The guards noticed. One of them, Sergeant Willard, made a note in his journal. Morale up among women, no apparent reason. Feels like peace in the middle of hell. But peace was dangerous. Rumors of unauthorized empathy could wreck careers faster than bullets. The military code was simple. Compassion wasn't part of the chain of command. One evening, Helen found a small origami crane on her cot. It was folded from ration paper, clumsy but perfect. No one admitted to leaving it, but she didn't need to ask. She placed it in her pocket and smiled for the first time in months. Outside, the private who had hidden the cloth stood near the fence again, watching. When Helen walked past, their eyes met for half a second. Neither spoke, but both knew they were part of the same quiet rebellion, one that crossed gender, language, and uniform. By then, the officer in charge had begun to sense something wrong. Supplies weren't matching up. Discipline reports were cleaner than usual, too clean. Someone, somewhere, was softening the edges of war. And in a place built on control, kindness could look like conspiracy. That suspicion would soon reach the colonel's desk. The paper trail began with a single nervous sentence: possible breach of sanitation protocol by medical staff. It was typed on an Underwood machine in the camp office, dated August 1945, and signed by a lieutenant who had no idea what storm he'd just started. Within days, that note was stamped urgent and sent up the chain. By the time it reached the regional command, the story had mutated. A nurse allegedly aiding enemy prisoners. A guard suspected of withholding confiscated materials. The facts were ghosts now, reshaped by rumor, polished by fear. Inside the camp, Helen felt the tension before anyone said a word. The guards stopped joking with her. The officer wouldn't meet her eyes. She knew the report had reached someone powerful because silence had replaced small talk. That same morning, the private found a copy of the report draft left carelessly on a desk. His name wasn't on it, but he saw his sin between the lines. The phrase noncompliance during disposal protocol stared back at him like an accusation. Carved in metal, across the Pacific, official numbers told another story. In 1940, 5 alone, 6 separate cases of disciplinary hearings were filed against medical or support personnel. Inappropriate fraternization with POW. Most were dismissed quietly, buried beneath larger headlines of surrender and victory. But here, in this camp, the report wasn't about punishment. It was about control. Someone had to reassert it. The colonel's desk was stacked with maps and casualty charts when the folder arrived. He flipped it open, read a few lines, then leaned back, expression unreadable. A nurse giving prisoners comfort, he muttered. Is that what we're calling a crime now? In his war-weary eyes, the lines between enemy and victim had blurred long ago. Still, procedure demanded a response. He tapped his pen against the desk, staring at the paper like it might answer him. Meanwhile, Helen sat in the infirmary, tracing the outline of the origami crane in her pocket. The paper had softened from her fingers, but its message remained sharp hope folded into defiance. Outside, a Jeep engine growled. The colonel was coming, and what he'd decide next would determine whether Mercy survived another day. The colonel arrived just before noon, the sun cutting hard lines across his face as he stepped out of the Jeep. He looked exhausted, uniform pressed but eyes hollow, the kind of man who'd seen too many lines drawn and erased in blood. Inside the command hut, the officer stood stiff beside a pile of folders. On top sat the report, improper conduct by nursing personnel. The colonel flipped through it silently. He saw the accusations, the witness statements, the regulation numbers quoted in clean military font, and then a photograph. One of the Japanese women wearing an oversized uniform, eyes sunken but calm. The caption read, "Reissue successful." Something about her expression stopped him cold. He closed the folder. War's almost over. He said flatly, "Tokyo's surrender's a matter of days." The officer blinked. "Sir, shall we initiate inquiry?" The colonel shook his head. "No, you'll file it. But don't follow up." That was how Mercy survived, through exhaustion, not approval. He knew what the rules said. He also knew what the war had done to those rules. Somewhere between orders and humanity, people like Helen had found a narrow space to breathe. He wasn't about to suffocate them. In his journal, found decades later in an archive, he'd written one line about that moment. Compassion doesn't win wars, but maybe it helps us end them. Outside, the camp was already shifting. Rumors of Japan's surrender had reached even the prisoners. A strange, quiet hope buzzed beneath the daily drills. Trucks were being repaired, rations packed. Everyone felt it, the war machine slowing, almost stalling. Helen walked the perimeter that evening, her head down. She didn't know the colonel had shelved the report. All she knew was that she hadn't been arrested, and the guards had stopped watching her so closely. She took it as a sign. The private, standing near the fence, caught her glance. No words, just a shared exhale of relief. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe the fire had burned its last. And then came the sound, distant engines, a convoy rolling in through the mud. Liberation. Trucks. By morning, the gates would open. The sound came before the sight, the low, throaty rumble of engines grinding over mud. Every head in the camp turned. Trucks painted with white stars rolled toward the gate, their sides plastered with dust and exhaustion. Liberation had arrived, though no one dared to cheer. The guards stood uncertain, the prisoners stood still, and for the first time in years, silence didn't mean fear. It meant disbelief. An officer shouted something in English. Another repeated it in Japanese. Prepare for transfer. You are going home. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. The women gathered in rows, each wearing the same shapeless khaki uniform they'd been forced to take weeks earlier. No undergarments, no belongings, just those ill-fitting symbols of survival. Yet many carried something hidden, scraps of cloth sewn into seams, folded paper cranes, bits of thread stitched under collars. Officially, they owned nothing. Unofficially, they carried proof that they had endured. The young private stood near the transport truck, helmet under his arm. He watched as the women filed past. The Yokohama teacher paused in front of him, eyes meeting his for the first time since that night by the fire. She reached into her pocket and pressed something into his palm, a tiny knot of fabric, barely the size of a coin. Keep it, she whispered. You remembered us. He froze. Before he could answer, she was gone, swallowed by the line of women climbing onto the truck beds. Official report would later describe the event in sterile language. All female internees released without incident. Personal effects none, but history doesn't write down the weight of a moment, the way a soldier's hand shook as he held the last remnant of what he once tried to burn. That night, after the truck rolled away, the camp was quiet again. No orders, no fires, just the sound of wind moving through empty barracks. The private walked back to his hut and unfolded the cloth. He pressed it to his face, breathing in the faint trace of smoke and soap. For the first time, he understood what mercy had cost and what it had saved. Years later, one of those women would write a memoir, and in its pages, she would remember him not as a guard, but as the man who hesitated. Decades later, Tokyo was unrecognizable neon where there had once been rubble, laughter where sirens had screamed. In a small wooden house on the city's outskirts, an elderly woman sat by her window as rain tapped gently against the glass. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded a faded square of cloth, yellowed with time and age. It was soft now, almost translucent, but the smell of ash still lived deep in its fibers. She pressed it to her face, eyes closing. For a moment, she wasn't old. She was 20 again, standing behind wire in Okinawa, watching smoke rise. The world had called it surrender. She remembered it as survival. Her name was Keiko Tanaka, the Yokohama teacher. In the 1970s, she began writing her memoir. The title came to her instantly, The Last Cloth. Her family thought it strange, too small a symbol for a war so vast. But to her, that cloth carried everything the headlines had missed: the humiliation, the mercy, the quiet defiance that no bomb or order could erase. Only 3 memoirs by Japanese female POW survived post or censorship. Hers was one of them. She wrote, in plain, steady language, they burned what we wore, but not what we were. The pages weren't about bitterness. They were about memory and the fragments of kindness that kept her alive when humanity seemed extinct. She never learned the name of the young American soldier who had hesitated that day by the fire. All she knew was that he'd paused, and that pause had changed everything. In her memoir, she called him the man who remembered his sister. In a library archive in Ohio, decades later, a researcher found her book by accident. Next to it, in a box of military artifacts, he discovered a folded piece of white fabric preserved in wax paper. On the label, in faded ink, was a single note, "From Okinawa, kept safe," 2 pieces of cloth, separated by oceans and time, telling the same story. Keiko's last line reads simply, "That cloth wasn't clothing." It was proof we endured. She died a year later, the fabric folded neatly beside her bed. The world had moved on, but her small act of remembrance had done what war could not: bridge enemies through empathy, because in the end, survival isn't measured in battles won. It's measured in what we choose to keep.